everybody. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. I'm Molly Herford, and when I am not working on the Shred Girls series, I'm probably on this podcast, or I am working on an article all about training, nutrition, and other endurance sports stuff.
And I'm Peter Glassford. I'm a registered kinesiologist and an endurance coach, and you are here on the Consummate Athlete Podcast, where we talk about lots of different sports, often about endurance sports, and we talk to the people who do them and people who coach them and are experts in various parts of them.
Yeah, and today's episode is definitely one of the more sciencey, we'll say into the weeds ones. So all of you data nerds out there are going to be pretty stoked on it. But before we get into that, Peter, what have you been up to?
Well, I, as you can probably hear, have a bit of a cold of sorts. It's been really odd, actually. I felt really, really good the entire time, but had sort of a stuffy nose and then lost my voice. Sort of was coaching all one day and, just lost my voice completely. Still no sore throat, still felt fine, sleeping relatively well, and so it's still sort of cackly voice, but hopefully we're getting over. Each day's a little better.
And I mean, I think the important maybe takeaway to pull from this is that Peter did actually take some time off last week. We both were a little under the weather, so we spent an actual day just resting and recovering and, trying to be the good athletes we are, which means getting a lot of sleep and a lot of rest when we're not feeling optimal.
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah, definitely took a few easier days and trying just to avoid breathing really deeply, right? And so we'll see. Tried to hit it myself with, I have sort of my little protocol of ginger and all sorts of shooters, and
don't try this at home.
Yeah, it's sort of disgusting, but
super disgusting.
It didn't work. I've won though. I've won the battle since before Christmas.
Oh boy.
Thought I was getting sick, starting to get sniffles. Hit it with my protocol, got out. So you lose some, but I think it was after Molly's book came out. Shred Girls on all the bookstores. We're seeing them at bookstores. It's an actual book on the bookshelves, also on Amazon. So Molly's book came out, which was a big sort of build up for us over even the last year, and just getting through camps and the first race, which my goal was to not be sick before the first race. So goal was achieved, and then there's that come down. So such is life. How about you?
On the topic of Shred Girls, it's been actually really cool. I've had a lot of people messaging and, Instagramming pictures of the book on shelves at bookstores and Barnes & Noble and kind of all that stuff, and, pictures of them reading with their kids or their kids reading it. I've heard about kids not wanting to put it down when they go to school, so that's all just the most heartwarming, greatest stuff to hear. So if you have a copy already and, you found it in a bookstore or, you're reading it, please, by all means, shoot me a line, send me a picture. That makes me so happy. Or leave a review on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever. That's also super helpful. As for me, I don't know. I'm pretty recovered from my big race, which is great because for me last year, racing a 50K mountain run kind of put me out for a solid month after, running, but definitely took me a long time to come back from it. This time, took a couple days off and kind of came right back to training. This weekend, I ran, a total of 26 miles, and my coach made the comment that, the 16-mile run I had on Saturday a couple months ago even, that was a big honking deal and like a cause for, serious celebration that I made it through that run, and that was amazing and awesome. And this Saturday, it was just like, of course I'm going to go out and run 16 miles on trails and, do this elevation and hit these really, technical, windy trails up here. And it felt normal. It didn't feel like a huge accomplishment. It just felt like this was a good day of training, and I feel great.
Yeah, and important to look back like that, right? And I think a lot of people, I was just talking to clients this past week, and, it's not going as well, again, such is life.
Sure.
But I think it's important to remember, things change not quickly, not overnight, but, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, with sort of consistent action, right? You started with run walking for 20 minutes.
Yeah, back in January, I couldn't run for 10 minutes at a time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the days go by slowly, but the years, they go by fast or something. So I think that's maybe the takeaway from yours. if we have to pull takeaways from everything in life.
I like a good takeaway.
I guess.
All right. Today's guest, we have
Hunter Allen.
Hunter Allen, and I was trying to think up like super coach, mega coach, coach extraordinaire.
I don't know if he even needs you to say that, but he's definitely a coach that's been involved in a lot of things, right? The Training Peaks is sort of the online sort of calendar software that a lot of coaches and athletes use. He was very involved in that. He's been involved in, high level road racing, as we talk about sort of his upbringing in BMX racing, and then transitioning into sort of the collegiate road racing scene, which I didn't really know his own athletic history. I followed Hunter as a coach for a long time and sort of definitely taking cues from him in my coaching career, if not also my athletic career.
He's been coaching for over 25 years now.
Yeah. And he was really solid, like power. Like he rode on Navigators, which was like a pretty legit sort of, I guess, continental team maybe, but like US based team. So we talk about that. We talk about how power, he brought power sort of the US BMX team for the Olympics. Which is pretty cool. And also I didn't sort of know he had any sort of, but again, he sort of started in BMX. So he had sort of that interest, and it's really interesting just how he used power for that. But definitely this podcast, we get into, sort of the new era of power training, and his latest book that he co-authored with Andy Cogan and McGregor, I believe. Is it McGregor? I apologize, McGregor.
Training and Racing with the Power Meter, edition 3.
Right. Yeah. So this book's been out, and it was sort of the main book that people get when they're getting a power meter and they want to sort of figure out how to train. So there's a lot of actionable information in this. It is Stephen McGregor, and I apologize, Dr. Stephen McGregor. And so the book has been around for a while, and so this is a new edition that's added a bunch of new information about power data now that we have more software and more sort of processing power out there.
It's probably pretty interesting if you have the first edition to even get this one and just see what we know about power, how it's measured, what the devices and software are, like how that's changed over the years, because that's one of the most rapidly developing fields, I'd say.
It is, and it's especially, like, I'm not great with numbers. I mean, I'm pretty good at, but I've been practicing for over 20 years with training, right? And so I find I've read all 3 editions, and this one I've been underlining and highlighting and really taking in the book. And a lot of the stuff is stuff I've read before, and, I've done all the Training Peaks certifications and all the different power training things. I stay on top of this stuff, but I really enjoyed this episode with Hunter. And I think we did pull out enough sort of actionables if you stick with it, and, you can jump through if the stuff gets a little too technical. There are some stuff, training for masters and the time crunch, so sort of what are the concepts, what is his favorite workout for time crunched folks. We talk a little bit pacing and what power can sort of help as far as pacing strategy, which is also covered in the book. Just lots of good power data. So hopefully this is interesting to folks. If you love it or you hate it, we'd love to sort of hear and sort of what you'd like to hear more of. But
I don't want to hear if you hate it. That's mean.
Well, not hate it, but this was a little too nerdy for me, and that's fine. I'll take that on. I can be nerdy. That's fine.
All right. Well, enjoy this nerd out with Coach Hunter Allen.
All right. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. We have Hunter Allen today, and I'm very excited. Hunter is a coach I've looked up to and tried to read everything he's had. And we actually did meet one time at a course in Ontario with the Ontario Cycling Association. I don't know if he remembers, but I want to welcome Hunter to the podcast. And just really thankful you were able to make some time for us today.
Oh, thanks, Peter. No, I do remember that. Absolutely. It was great. It's always great to do some fun seminars and stuff up north there. So it was great.
Yeah, I don't recall what the weather was, but hopefully it was nicer weather. But I think we tend to do the indoor stuff in the winter, so I'm sure it was stormy.
There you go. Well, snow is still pretty too, as long as you just don't get stuck in it.
Right. Or you're enjoying it with skiing or something, I guess. But
there you go.
So I always like to just sort of ask what people have been up to. What have you been spending your time on the last week or so?
Yeah, I think just recently this past week has been we shot a bunch of videos. I've done a bunch of work on the ICG, which stands for Indoor Cycling Group, Indoor Bicycle, and they came to me probably, I guess, it's been 4 years now, and asked me if I would help them develop a indoor bike, spinning bike, similar to, kind of what you see in classrooms, but made for indoors with a really accurate power meter and a bike that people who are real cyclists would want to use and put in their house and stuff. So we came out with the IC8. And it's got a really accurate power meter. The thing is amazing, down to within 10 watts. I mean, it's less than 1%. It's craziness. It's super accurate. It's less than 10 watts, like less than 3 watts. It's so accurate. And it's got FTP. Put your FTP in the head unit. It gives you your training zones, all this jazz. So they were here last week. We shot like 20 videos, all kind of 3-minute YouTube, Facebook type stuff. So it's always fun to do that kind of stuff.
Sure. And do you see that bike being used? Like, who's the user? Like, is it someone who's mostly cycling indoors, or do you see even people who have outdoor bikes sort of using it to have something that's really precise and sort of set up for indoors?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both. I mean, they're putting these in gyms and clubs and stuff, but really this IC8 was designed to put in somebody's home and used as a substitute for putting their own bicycle and beating up their own bicycle on an indoor trainer. I think that's really what it was for. It's super adjustable and all that jazz. It's Ant Plus compatible, so it captures all your data from your Garmin, and you pair it to your heart rate monitor and all that jazz, and you can ride it on Zwift. Now, you have to, it doesn't have an erg mode in there, so you have to manually, increase the resistance if you're doing a workout or something like that. But, I tell you, I go back and forth every winter. I always have this struggle with my athletes and myself personally, where riding indoors, like you're riding on the erg mode, and sometimes it just kills you, with your cadence.
Yeah,
and you're just dying at 70 RPM all winter long. Versus, well, I'm just going to put it in free ride mode and just change the load myself based on cadence and gearing and hit the plus and minus button kind of thing.
Right.
So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to just be able to have it in free ride mode, so to speak, and just change the load yourself.
Well, I think my clients are probably grimacing hearing you say that, because we've had very similar discussions about the pros and cons of erg mode and not shifting all winter if you intend to go and mountain bike or accelerate at any point in the near future. So
Right.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, so the indoor stuff is huge. I don't want to get too far down that, but we'll maybe come back to that. But I wanted to also ask, I was going through sort of a bunch of bios and stuff and just sort of going through it, and I didn't realize the BMX connection, that you were at the Beijing Olympics coaching. Like, how did that connect? I mean, I realize it's cycling and all that, but how did that come down sort of to come to you?
Yeah. Well, I raced BMX forever. That's how I got into cycling.
Wow.
I started BMX when I was 11 and raced all the way until I was 18, and when I went off to university. And, so it's been, a passion of mine and my first love in cycling forever. So I really enjoyed it. And then I guess it was probably 2000. Well, once BMX got included in the Olympics for 2008 Olympics, I came to Steve Johnson, the CEO of USA Cycling then in 2006, end of 2006 or so, and said, hey, I really want to be involved in the BMX team, and I think I can bring a lot to it with just all of our power meter analysis, and what can we do, and what can we learn, and can we change some training, can we help do testing on athletes, and just bring this whole new, not really new at the time, but new to BMX anyway, technology. And he was like, oh, that's a great idea. And so that was how it got started. And we put SRM custom made BMX power meters for us on, I can't remember the name of the crank that Shimano had, a BMX crank that they were able to make power meters for.
Right.
And we put them on all the BMXers, the hopefuls. I think we had like 12 or 15 SRMs that we had, and we really fortunate in the fact that the guy who built the Beijing track. He went over to Beijing, built that track, and then came back to the U.S. And then the USA Cycling hired him to build the exact replica of the track.
Wow.
At the Olympic Training Center in Chula Vista. So we were super fortunate. I mean, we actually had the exact replica down to like the inch of the track in Beijing. And so all of our athletes, and the track actually was open internationally to anybody. I think we had some Canadian BMXers there and all kinds of people, New Zealand's, Australian. I mean, we had Colombians, all kinds of people there practicing on it. So it wasn't like it was just ours or anything, but that gave us some incredible insights into the demands of the event itself from a power meter perspective, because we never had power meters on BMXers.
Yeah.
And these guys they would put out 2,500 watts off the starting gate. I mean, just insane numbers.
Wow.
They would go around the first turn. They would come out of the first turn and they would do 180 RPM and do 1,800 watts coming out of the first turn.
Yeah.
And it was just really amazing. So we learned a lot about that, and it was it helped us make some really good decisions about who were the best riders to be on the team, and then it helped, and it defined a lot of our training protocols that we gave the riders in order to be ready for that track in Beijing. So yeah, it was super fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, I had no idea that was sort of where you came from. And I do want to, I'm going to come back to the BMX stuff because I think that might be helpful in our power metrics in a bit. But you also then raced road for the Navigators, which to me is like, that's just like awesome development. Now you're seeing someone who's, been dabbling in different disciplines. So do you want to can you speak to just even briefly sort of that progression as a younger person racing BMX, and then eventually as a, I guess, mature athlete racing on the road? Like how did you get from point A to point B?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was at university and just kind of kicking around on my BMX bike, and one of my good friends was a mountain biker, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, you got amazing amazing skills, bike handling skills. Why don't you come mountain biking with me?" And I found a used mountain bike to just borrow from another buddy, and we went mountain biking, and I was like, "Wow, this is like BMX through the woods. This is awesome!"
Right.
And so then, I was great on all the technical stuff, but I didn't have any cardiovascular system developed at all, of course. So it took me a while to get that, and raced a bunch of mountain bikes. And then at about the same time, in their late 80s, collegiate cycling was just starting here in the U.S. And so we were like, whoa, we can like race and have a college team. So then we both got road bikes and started racing in the collegiate races, and saw, wow, this is really fun. And so then we ended up not racing mountain bikes anymore. Right. And we started racing on the road all the time. And that was just a blast. And so that was, I just kept getting better and better and better and better. And I got to be a Cat 1 my senior year at university. And then it was like, okay, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I said, I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to see if I can become a pro cyclist and see if I can do something with this. So raced in California the rest of that year, won 3 Pro 1-2s while I was still a Cat 1, and that got me on a team in Spain in '92 and raced on an amateur team in Spain out of San Sebastian, and that was super fun. And then came back and got on the Navigators team and raced as a pro on the Navigators team for a few years. So that was the journey.
Wow. It sounds like a perfect recipe, right? Like you're sort of working on skills and having fun, that's BMX, right? And then incorporating sort of that community and like you say, it was sort of just, obvious you're going to race road in university or in college because it's such a great atmosphere, right? And then you hope that, whatever, like that enthusiasm sort of just goes off and people will become pros, elites, whatever. But awesome. It's always cool to sort of connect those two dots. So I think next, you have this latest edition of your book out, which has been, I think for a lot of people, a handbook. It's titled Training and Racing with a Power Meter. And this is the 3rd edition. So, it's serious when we're getting into editions of books here. But, it's really a great book for teaching people right from the get-go, right? That you don't have to be, talking about high-level stuff or even have had a power meter, right? Like, is that the idea?
Right.
When you're writing this, you're thinking about it could be a beginner, it could be someone who knows what they're talking about or thinks they know.
Yeah, I mean, it was like really the how-to manual, and that's been the intention all along. Is number one, set out kind of the 7 principles of power training and say, okay, if you did these 7 things, you're really training with a power meter. And that was the initial goal, is to give people that, just like, how do I do this? What do I do now I got one of these things? So really that's the first 4 chapters of the book are really dedicated to just how do I use this, and what do I do? How do I get started? After that, then it kind of dives deeper into, well, okay, now that I've been training with this thing, what do all these squiggly lines mean?
Right. It's very confusing.
Yeah. And especially for those people who aren't that analytical, and it's kind of, okay, how do we demystify this so that it makes sense? Like, oh, this line means this and this line means that. And so that was really the second half of the book, is trying to explain a bit about what those lines mean, and then take it even further and talk about, well, how do I develop a training plan? How do I actually use this now as a tool for a training plan to help me peak for an event, or just improve my FTP, and in that regard. And then there are all kinds of little different case studies we've got in there, and examples and stuff of what people have done. And so I hope that's been my intention all along, is to make it so that, again, kind of take you through that process. So each chapter builds upon itself and takes you through. So once you're done with it, you're like, okay, wow, I really understand training the power meter now.
Yeah. And I think it accomplishes that. And like anything, I think things evolve too, right? And in the last, I don't know how many years we've been now with like the newer WKO and the newer metrics, I guess, but the language of power training and what we're able to do with the big data has sort of evolved. And I guess that's one of the big reasons for this 3rd edition, is sort of adapting to these newer metrics and newer data analysis techniques, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been 10 years. I mean, we came out with the 2nd edition in 2009, so it's been 10 years since we came out with the 3rd edition. And a lot of the reason why we haven't come out with the 3rd edition was because, we didn't have an update in software. We didn't have some new tools that we really needed to be able to use some of these more advanced metrics and such. And so once we got that dialed in with the WKO4 software, then it was like, okay, cool. Now we can actually start looking at this at a more individualized perspective, because we found that, really early on in training with a power meter, that not everybody fit exactly in the Coggan, levels perfectly, especially those upper ones above FTP. If you look at kind of the VO2 max range, level 5, and say, okay, well, that's 106 to 120% of your FTP. And, you should be able to hold that somewhere between 3 to 8 minutes. So if, for example, right in the middle, about 115% or so, that's about 5 minutes. And most people can hold about 115% for 5 minutes. But we saw pretty early on, like, wow, some people could hold 150% for 5 minutes, like just huge numbers.
Yeah.
And so we need to account for that individual nature of people's unique physiology, and that was one of the big stepping stones that is made. It was created, in this new edition, talking about how we even further individualize that training for people.
Now, you were one of the co-founders of Training Peaks, which a lot of athletes are using sort of to talk to their coach or to follow a training plan online. And you mentioned WKO Plus, which is sort of a offline, I guess, software, which I found huge. We had Tim Cusack come up as well, which was an amazing weekend. And like for me, it's been huge from a coaching perspective. And so what you're alluding to is sort of the zones and when we have all this data from an athlete, all their sort of peak powers, all the information from these power meters, now you can put it into this software and sort of really customize what those zones are, right? Essentially, that's what you're talking about.
Exactly. So basically now the software is able to, just take all of your data and give you some, based on that data set, give you some pretty unique measures of what kind of phenotype are you? I mean, we've always had power profiling. We've had power profiling forever, which helped us to understand our strengths and weaknesses. And this really is the same thing, but just at a deeper level. And now instead of making you figure out, oh, well, I'm a time trialist or I'm a sprinter or whatever, the software kind of says, oh, you're a time trialist or you're an all-arounder or you're a pursuiter. And then that helps to go from that direction. And then at the same time, if you are one of these outliers that has some fairly unique individual pieces to your physiology, there are individual training levels now. So that's been really fun to be able to have and look at and say, okay, well, gosh, I should be training from 360 watts to 487 watts if I want to improve my anaerobic ability, instead of this kind of a little bit lower area. Usually that's the case, is that the Coggins zones will be lower. So again, making sure that you are hitting the training zones that you want to and addressing the energy systems you want to, because I think to me, that's one of the magical things about having a power meter, and revolutionary things about having a power meter, is the fact that, before we didn't really know, are we training the right system even? Are we going hard enough to train our VO2 max? Are we going hard enough to improve our FTP? Maybe I'm too tired and I can't actually hit the numbers that I should be hitting. With heart rate, we just didn't really know, and certainly speed didn't really help that much. So with a power meter, all of a sudden it's almost like this really kind of guarantee, like, hey, if you're between these watts and for this time frame, you're training this zone, you're training this energy system, and it's going to improve. You do enough work there, it's going to get better. So I think that's really a fun part of training with a power meter.
Yeah. It's been really liked sort of seeing, I think I've done a lot more 40-second and sort of shorter intervals than I would have done in the past. And I tend to be the type of athlete that doesn't do well over FTP. So, it's been interesting how it evolves things. I'm wondering, the big question is always around what's your FTP and how do you set your FTP? And some of this, when you have the data, it should be fairly evident. But not always. And so one of the new metrics is the modeled FTP or MFTP. I'm wondering if you could sort of walk us through that, even just briefly. I know it can get technical, but just a brief explanation.
Sure. So the modeled FTP is an FTP that's been modeled based on your data, and it comes from what's called the power duration curve. So many of us, especially those who have read the first and second edition, know and understand what's called our mean maximal power curve. The mean maximal, meaning mean is your average, maximal being your best, so average best power curve. So it's a curve of your data, like at 5 seconds, what's your best 5 seconds, what's your best 30 seconds, what's your best minute, what's your best 4 minutes and 27 seconds, etc. So it creates this curve with time being on the x-axis and watts on the y-axis. And that's what you actually have done, right? That's what you've done in your training or racing. So the power duration curve is a curve that goes through all of that is a line of best fit, and sometimes a little high, again, sometimes a little low, but it's a line of best fit, and looks at the different changes and the rate of change between different time ranges, and so that helps us to understand where there are different essentially break points in your energy systems where, like, well, maybe right here, because all of a sudden there's this pretty dramatic drop off in watts between 52 minutes and 58 minutes. This is really what your FTP right here is. So it looks at that bend out near an hour in the curve, and that establishes what your modeled FTP is. So again, it's looking around about an hour. Not always going to be right an hour, but darn close. And again, it's a model, right? So a lot of people, somebody emailed me the other day, is like, man, I went out and did 292 watts for 60 minutes, and I did 312 watts for 20 minutes, but my model FTP says it's 284. Well, so remember, it's a model, and it's also only looking at the last 90 days. So it's kind of got a rolling average of the last 90 days. So just because you did a new 60-minute best doesn't mean that model is going to update to it right away. So it's a point of triangulation. I want a 20-minute test. I want a 60-minute test. I want to look at the model FTP. I want to look at some data from your races and from your training. I'm looking at all those things to determine really what is your FTP. So, but it's a really nice, useful tool.
Yeah, and I find a lot of those debates are like, it's really not that big a deal, right? Like 10 watts here and there, like it's all getting divided by percentages, right? So right. The overlap in between 10 watts at FTP is very, very small, even for like a really solid FTP, right? So
yeah.
Okay, so that's model FTP, and I'll put a couple links just because I know we're talking about graphs and lines and stuff, but hopefully that makes sense, that you're sort of trying to profile this line of your best. The other interesting one, which maybe might tie into, and you can maybe even pick between FRC and PMAX, relating to sort of the BMX athlete, especially maybe. Can you explain sort of these newer metrics as well? So we all know FTP, or a lot of us do, but some of these new ones might be a little foreign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So so FRC is what we call, so we know FTP, functional threshold power, and that's essentially the what we call the power you can maintain in a quasi-steady state for, a period of time, generally around an hour before you start fatiguing. Well, what we call FRC is functional reserve capacity. And this is really the amount of work you can do above your FTP. Okay, so think of your functional reserve capacity as a somewhat of an umbrella above that goes above that kind of encompasses your sprint, your neuromuscular power, or what we call Pmax. I'll talk about that in a second, and then also your anaerobic capacity and your VO2 max. So that really kind of encompasses those three energy systems. And it's a neat way to think of it, because we have these different separate energy systems, and I would claim that they're very valid reasons for training those three. But at the same time, there's also really good reasons to combine them into one. Number one is because it helps us to understand a little bit about what area should we be stronger in, and how can we improve it? So if you think of another little simple analogy might be to think of your FRC is that you had a button on your handlebars, and basically you could push that button down, and you could hold it all the way down for 10 seconds, and you would get this massive power boost for 10 seconds. But you would completely decharge that battery, right? If you had like a little electric motor in your bike, right? And you could just push it down for 10 seconds.
I'm thinking like Fast and the Furious NOS buttons here. Like
right, exactly.
Hit it with the NOS, yeah.
Right. If you hold it down too long, you're going to blow it up.
Right.
right? I mean, exactly kind of the same thing, right? Because that's what happens, right? I mean, that's your functional reserve capacity. So if you want to charge up a hill and you want to go up this hill and, you've got, let's say, 14 kilojoules of work that has available for you to do. Well, what does that mean? I mean, 14 kilojoules, that's hard to translate in wattage. Well, if you think about it and say, okay, well, if you move the decimal place over 2, so we say 14, so 1,400, so it would be 1,400 watts that you had available to do work with for 10 seconds. So if you could actually hold 1,400 watts for 10 seconds, you would exhaust that battery completely. Now, most of us can't hold 1,400 watts for 10 seconds, so we could divide it, by 2 and double the time. So, 20 seconds. Can you hold 700 watts for 20 seconds? And a lot of us could do that, and that would be the same thing. You would exhaust that system or those combinations of systems, that functional reserve capacity, in 20 seconds. Now, in order to recharge that battery, you've got to go back underneath your FTP. So you've got to recharge it to say, okay, I'm going to get ready for the next attack kind of thing. And so it's a really interesting way to look at it because it helps us to understand, one, again, further depth into your strengths and weaknesses and what you might use for an upcoming event and how you might use it to your advantage. And then 2, you might be able to use it so that you can say, well, how much freshness do I have and how much fatigue do I have and how is that really related to your functional reserve capacity so that you ensure that you come to the event with, if you need a lot of it, you ensure you come to the event with the right amount.
I see. So you're suggesting then that if someone were like really pushing the volume, then that their FRC would be lower? Am I interpreting that?
Yeah, for sure. So as you get more and more fatigued, that's definitely gonna go down. There's no doubt about that, and it's gonna be, I need to be, I'm gonna get more and more fatigued because fatigue, the number one thing that is, let's back up a little bit. So your anaerobic capacity, which is a large component of your functional reserve capacity, your anaerobic capacity when you're purely anaerobic, is its greatest when you're fresh. So when you've been sitting on the couch for 2 months and not riding your bike, you've got massive amount of anaerobic capacity.
Right.
You want to at your best 1 minute, just go sit on the couch for a month and then go up a hill for 1 minute as hard as you can. You'll probably crack your best 1 minute out.
Right. Or like if you go to, I've seen like shop mechanics who like haven't been riding, they're just working in a shop, and you'll get them on like a trainer or something, and they'll do like a 10-second sprint or a 15-second sprint, and it'll be like 1,500 watts or something more than like most cyclists would ever do, right? And it's just exactly that, like they're fueled by donuts and well rested.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So that's exactly it. And you never know. I mean, I think that's one of those things that it is a key part of it. So now, if you're highly fatigued, meaning you've been training for many, many, many days, that anaerobic ability, that functional reserve capacity is going to be much lower. You just don't have the ability to dig into that, right? Your battery's decharged and you haven't really given it a chance to recharge because it does get, it goes lower and lower and lower and lower and lower as you get more and more fatigued throughout the day or throughout the training, week after week after.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because that's often a common request. I'm sure you get it. The climbing feels slow, or my sprinting, I couldn't recover to like make the attacks or whatever. And then it sometimes doesn't get sort of correlated to like, well, you're also just riding, hard endurance or whatever, like all the time. You're never recovering, right, or ever working on that top end.
Yep, exactly.
Awesome. I wonder, I mean, PMAX, do you want to just touch on it briefly?
Sure. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Sorry. Yeah,
No, no problem. That was good.
There.
I love the FRC stuff. That's great.
I'll just talk about this stuff all day, as you know. So for a really long time, we've done we've used your best 5 seconds as the best measurement of neuromuscular power. Neuromuscular power is the ability to contract and relax your muscles as quickly as you can and with the most force that you can. So we want to know, well, okay, what's your maximum wattage? And like I said earlier, those BMXers, I mean, they could do 2,500 watts for a second right off of the starting gate. But that's just a single sample. And a lot of these power meters, I don't really believe any single sample, because the way that they measure is they measure in time, and you don't know where the starting time is and where your crank arm is in what phase of the pedal stroke it is and that time. And so, you might crack out something really big one day, 1,400 watts, and you never ever do it again because of just this, the time and space and the moon and everything else aligned type of thing.
Right.
So we always looked at our best 5 seconds, and it's still a very good measurement of neuromuscular power. There's nothing wrong with that. But PMAX allows us to look at, again, with a little bit better granularity in some of the software that we're using now and some of the power meters themselves, we can see the best power for one complete pedal stroke, left and right leg. Right? Because you want to see both sides. You want to see, well, what can my left leg do and my right leg at its maximum? And that's really what we call your PMAX. And so that really sets that upper limit of what your neuromuscular power is. So that's a nice measurement. I've been very pleased with that. And it still doesn't account for bad power meter data. I mean, you got to clean up your data and stuff. Sometimes they're going to be, you're going to have bad data there, but other times it's still pretty good.
Do you have a preferred way to test that other than just like going out and sprinting?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. The best way to test your sprint is go out and just do a bunch of sprints. I really like to test both small ring sprints and big ring sprints. Some of us are going to have our best PMAX and 5 seconds, PMAX and 5 seconds in a small ring sprint. If you find a slightly uphill, you don't want to think anything craziness, but 4 or 5% or something like that, and do a small ring sprint up it. Do 3 or 4 because you might not knock it out the first time, and shift gears and stuff. That if you have more explosive power, you're going to probably do it in that small ring sprint. Then if you're, if you can do it in a big ring sprint, you might want to do that on a flatter road and start at 18 or 20 miles an hour or somewhere around 35 to 40 kilometers an hour or something like that. Then you sprint from that big chain ring, and you might actually get a better one that way. So I think you've got to always do it both ways. And I want to do 3 sprints, 3 small rings, 3 big rings, just because, again, the first or second one may not be the perfect one. I see a lot of times kind of get better as you do a few of those things.
Right. That makes sense. And then maybe last of the metrics here, and then we'll go on to some more juicy sort of FTP boosting secrets and more headline friendly stuff. But time to exhaustion, I think, is another one that people might find interesting. So do you want to just take us through TTE?
Yeah, absolutely. Time to exhaustion. Time to exhaustion is an interesting concept too, because it also looks at the curve, the power duration curve, overlaying on top of your mean maximal power. And the best way to really understand time to exhaustion is, let's say, for example, you go and do a 1-hour FTP test. All right, I'm going to go and I'm going to crack out this 1 hour, and I'm going to make it happen. In that hour, at the end of the hour, you end up averaging 250 watts. All right, so that's your FTP. All right, you did your very best. You got 250 watt average. Bang, you nailed it. That's 250 watts. Now, if you go back and you look at the power file, you'll notice that for the first 38 minutes of that, you held 270 watts, and then you kind of fell apart after 38 minutes, struggled home at 240 something watts, and end up averaging 250 watts total. So that would be, again, your FTP is still 250. So your time to exhaustion would be 38 minutes. And so that's really when you see that big drop off and holding a high rate of power close to your FTP. All right, it's not your FTP necessarily. Might be, but most of the times it isn't. And it's really that time just right before you fall off. So it's an interesting concept, because what happens is we find that we can average a higher number of watts for a little bit longer, and then as we become fatigued, then our power drops off. We still base our training zones around the 1 hour, but the time to exhaustion helps us to understand, okay, well, what is, what am I trying to train here? If I make it 24 minutes, then, well, gosh, you really need to increase your muscular resistance and your cardiovascular system as well. You make it out to 45 minutes, then, well, your muscular fatigue resistance is much higher. And then as you get closer and closer to an hour and even exceed an hour, then I use time to exhaustion as a leading indicator that your FTP is about to go up. So it's a great metric for that, is like, oh, wow, look, this athlete's all of a sudden, he's now got his TTE out to 58 minutes. He's probably on the cusp of an FTP improvement. So I like to use it that way too.
And is there a point though where you'd be aiming to get it lower for someone who's more on the BMX side of things, or even like a cyclocross type thing, versus the hour, or are you still seeing that sort of in the way you describe, sort of higher is better and then you see it go up, or longer is better and then you see it go up?
Right. Well, I think if for cyclocross, cyclocross is a little bit different, because it's got a tremendous number of these super high intensity bursts of anaerobic and neuromuscular power and VO2 max. So maybe you don't need to have quite such a high TTE for that one. Even if your race is an hour long, you can get away with certainly probably something in the 30-minute or 40-minute range. That would be fine. So I wouldn't worry too much about it right then. But at the same time, as you get fitter and fitter, that number is just going to naturally go up, because you're going to be able to hold it longer. The BMX stuff, it just doesn't really apply, because that's just so sprint oriented. Sure. It's over in 45 seconds maximum. So it really we don't really look at it that way from that perspective. There is, you can look at all kinds of different times to exhaustion. And so you could do a sprint time to exhaustion, which is, the Wingate test, essentially. How many watts and how long can you go kind of on the Wingate test, which is totally painful. I don't recommend that one. But
no.
If you're a sprinter, you got to have to do it. But yeah, no, that's part of it.
Awesome. Yeah. So those are lots of metrics. And now I'm wondering, there's some plans, there's some case studies in there. And a lot of it is focused around that raising of FTP or improving of FTP, getting fitter. I'm wondering if you can tease some of the newer sort of even just one workout or one of the techniques that you've sort of come across for this new updated edition.
Yeah, sure. No, we've got I've got a new training plan in there for triathletes, which is I'm really excited about, because triathletes have constantly been sending me emails for 10 years now saying, we want a training plan. So we got swim and run in there as well. So that's great because there's some really fun things that now are happening on this power meter side for running, and even the swimming devices now are pretty exciting too. So those things are pretty neat. And then too, masters athletes. I've got a great training plan in there on masters athletes because I think that's a large majority of us. I'm certainly in that category now, where and have been for a while. Of like, okay, well, how do I train differently now that I'm not 20 years old anymore? And what do I need to train, and what's the best bang for my buck? And then we've got a couple of the plans we had from the second edition, which are just tried and true. I mean, we've got a great threshold improvement plan and a great plan that's basically how to peak in 8 weeks. So those are great plans. But I think that I really like I like all the plans. All of them are really good, but it's been really fun writing the Masters one because again, it's something that I've tweaked over and over the years and kind of made it better and better and better. And one of those things that I think that makes a difference for those of us who are very time constrained and we don't recover quite as fast as we used to. So it helps to get the timing of the training a little bit more aligned. And one of my favorite workouts that is in here, and probably no surprise to anybody who knows me, is the sweet spot with doing bursts. So I mean, this is my kind of staple. Come back to all the time. I mean, because the number one determinant of performance is FTP. Right. So if your FTP is 250 and you raise it to 275, you're going to go faster. If your FTP is 275 and you raise it to 300, you're going to go faster. You're going to have more opportunities for success the higher that FTP is. So that's we always come back to how can we improve our FTP first for most of us. And so riding just below your FTP, what we call sweet spot, around 88 to 93% or 95% of your FTP, just underneath it, is a great place to ride. One, because you can spend a lot of time there. It's doable. It's like, man, I'm not suffering on the edge. I'm not dying right here. But I can, it takes, mental effort, but I can do it. And then you still get a tremendous amount of benefit riding there. It still really increases your FTP. So doing those, and then every 2 minutes doing a burst for 30 seconds at about 120% is a great way to start to increase your ability to maintain a higher FTP, to increase your fatigue resistance, to improve your lactate tolerance. It's a great place to be. And so I kind of liken it to, imagine if you have a bathtub, right? And in that bathtub, you've got a drain, you've got the faucet pouring water in the bathtub, and the drain is not draining as quickly as the water's coming in. So the bathtub is filling up, even though the drain's fully open. And then the bathtub gets to about 3/4 full of water. And then what happens is, then you take a fire hose and you fire hose it for about 30 seconds. The water comes all the way up to the top and almost goes into the floor of your bathroom. And then you turn the fire hose off and you turn all the water off and you let it drain out to about 3/4 full again. So that's you're still letting that drain go out, and then you go and you fire hose it again. So you're riding at sweet spot for 2 minutes, you fire hose it for 30 seconds or 20 seconds, and then you ride at sweet spot for 2 minutes, you fire hose it again, and what it does is it tells the body, it's like, hey everybody, we need a bigger drain. We need to drain more water. We don't necessarily need taller walls. The height of the walls is your FTP. The drain itself is your efficiency. So truly, like, more capillaries in the muscles, more stroke volume in the heart. We need more mitochondrial enzymes. All those things. We need true efficiency internally in our body, and doing that kind of work is really effective.
And that would be sort of like a classic 2x20, or what format would you put those sort of 2 minutes plus 30 seconds bursts?
Yeah. I mean, I think 2x20s are great. I think that's probably a good place to do them, because you can do 2x15s. 2x10s are a little short with bursts, but you can certainly do them even 2x10s, but definitely nothing shorter than that. I think those would be great. I'm definitely a kind of more of a 2x20 guy in doing those bursts. They're great. They're great intervals.
You mentioned triathlon plans, and some pacing stuff is really big, sort of, especially in the long course, but I think all triathlon. Is there anything you can sort of tease people as far as, how they can use their power meters for pacing, whether that's in training or on race day?
Yeah, I think in terms of pacing from a triathlon perspective, I mean, the number one goal when you have to think about it, you break it down and say, okay, well, what's the number one goal of the bike leg of the triathlon? One, you want to go as fast as you possibly can and still run as fast as you possibly can afterwards, right? So if you go too fast on the bike, right? If you go too fast on the bike, then you're not going to be able to run, or maybe you can only run half of it and you walk the rest of it, right? So that's a bummer. And I would say fail. Try again next time. But the goal is to make sure that you pace yourself so that you can run at the end and run strong all the way to the finish line. So, looking at pacing, there's a little table in the book that talks about pacing guideline, what percentage of FTP you should maintain if you are doing an Ironman, if you are doing a half Ironman, if you're doing Olympic distance, and then also, kind of what level of athlete are you? A pro triathlete is going to do, 75 or 78% of their FTP for the entire 112 miles. Don't recommend that for your typical age group athlete. That's probably going to be more around 68% or 70% for the typical age group athlete. And they'll still have enough for the run. They've done their training. So you don't want to overdo it. One of the biggest things, too, that I see in triathlon is just pedaling too slow. I mean, most triathletes just drone along at 80 RPM, and it's just, and they're using more force to do that with. They're pushing a bigger gear, or they're using more force. And using more force with the muscles, that takes more energy, and so that's taking muscle glycogen away from those muscles that you need on the run. So ride with a little faster cadence. Learn to ride at 90 RPM so that you shift the strain onto the cardiovascular system, and then that way you save the muscle glycogen in the legs for the run. So there's a whole section on quadrant analysis, and what is a good Ironman look like, a good half Ironman look like versus a bad half Ironman look like, so that way you can understand how cadence and force plays a role in that.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good thought too, and again, sort of, we're talking about power and power meters, but one of this maybe that gets overlooked sometimes now that everyone's onto FTP and power is that we can also often, at least most devices, will also give you a cadence, right? And sometimes that gets lost, and all we care about is FTP. But in the case of a performance like the triathlon, or even just in your actual FTP, or you talked about your sprints as well with the different cadences, right, and how that can greatly affect performances.
Absolutely. So
we've covered a lot of the questions, and we're getting close here. I don't want it to keep you too long. The last question that we got from a listener. I'm just trying to. So it's around TSS, or training stress score. And his question was sort of, if you don't have a power meter on all your bikes, or maybe you just have it indoors, or I think this would even apply if you had different power meters, I guess, potentially. But he's asking sort of, how do you consolidate sort of the HR heart rate TSS and then also sort of TSS, or just differing TSS outputs between those, to sort of have that picture of fitness that is sort of the PMC and TSS.
Right. Well, that's a challenge if you don't have a power meter to quantify your training stress. So if you have a heart rate monitor and you download your data into Training Peaks, it will give you a heart rate TSS. So that's better than nothing. That way at least you get some training stress score for that. The goal of having training stress score, a score for every ride, is that you can figure out what's my optimal training load. How much can I handle? Can I do 1,000 TSS in a week, every week, week in and week out? That's a really good thing to be able to do. But if you can't, then you will figure out, well, I can only do 800. That's going to be my number one that I can do. So I think that's probably the biggest goal here. And it's difficult to do it without some way to really quantify that. Now, from running, if you have a running device, let's say if you're a runner, there's using your Garmin watch, your 910 or 920 or whatever it is, downloading that data can give you a running TSS, our TSS score. And running TSS is really based on 45 minutes. So we got an hour for cycling. Well, about 45 minutes for running is most likely the a little more equivalent, since you've got a lot of skeletal stress that happens as well in running. So that's really what that looks like. And I think that's a little bit of it. And I tell you, the other thing that I think is pretty interesting, I don't know if you've ever used it yet or heard about it, but there's a new device out that you wear on your wrist called Whoop, WHOOP. Yeah, and Whoop is pretty daggone good, man. I'm very impressed with it. They've, for a really low cost, they've done a really good job. And in general, when my athletes are red on Whoop, they are red and they are tired and they need to rest. I just had a client this past weekend. He messaged me, Sunday morning, and was like, man, I'm red today. I just got up. I'm red. I'm like 18%. I'm really red. I'm tired. I'm crushed, from yesterday's ride and this week's training. I'm just going to take the day off. And is that okay? I was like, yeah, absolutely. Take the day off. You're tired. You're fatigued. You're 18%. That's pretty low. And then today he went out and he cracked out his best 5 minutes of the year.
Right.
It was like, it was just like all he needed was one day of rest.
Well, and I wonder, Hunter, too, like that's an awesome, I think you've gone exactly where I was hoping you would, but it's sort of getting at the point that like TSS is just one thing, right? And you want to sort of like, what is your FTP doing? When you do have power, or, how are you feeling on the bike, or, this HRV stuff, which I also use. But, that internal load, what is that? Versus I think sometimes the TSS is just like we're chasing higher TSS or some magical TSS number that we read about.
Right.
But it's missing the point of the bike riding, right? And the day-to-day.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean that's been the missing metric, Peter. I mean, we've never really had a way to measure life stress. How well are you sleeping at night? And what impact does alcohol have on that? I'm looking at my HRV, my heart rate variability, and my heart rate variability be 70s, 80s, 90s, or whatever. And then I'll have a single glass of wine, and it crushes it by like 40 points. I'm probably hypersensitive to it or whatever, but I mean, it's not like a bottle of wine. It's like a glass of wine. And so, I mean, that really impacts my heart rate variability. It clearly messes with my sleep. I just takes longer for me to recover from it. So, that's, besides like, oh crap, I can't drink wine anymore.
Right.
It takes into account, like, how well are you sleeping and what's going on the rest of your life and stuff. So that's been fun. It's really been interesting to start playing with Whoop and again, like you said, it's another point. It's another tool that can really make a difference in making decisions. Should I train today? Should I not train today? And it says, okay, yeah, you should train today. Okay, well then now use your power meter. How many intervals should I do today? Okay, well, go to the, section in Hunter's book that says, optimal intervals guideline. Okay, well, I'm going to do intervals until, I see a 10% drop in my repeats. Then I'm going to stop. Now you're training optimally.
Right.
So, we're using these different tools to help us.
Yeah, I like that. The multiple factors, right? And I think to that, the TSS idea, like you would see, maybe with that HRV or how you're feeling on the bike, you'd maybe start seeing, even with the heart rate TSS are a bit mixed relative to yourself, I would expect you'd see trends. If you were sort of doing the same mix of rides, indoors 1 day a week or whatever, mountain bike 1 day a week, whatever your thing is, you'd probably see that, fluctuation and what you're sort of expecting from the TSS. But I think that's spot on. Your example of your client with the HRV being really low, he maybe lets you know that he also was out drinking all night or something, or didn't sleep. And then you might also see in the TSS, TSB is really low, right? So they're quite deep in fatigue.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's pretty interesting. So, I think that's where always strive for the best data, right? A power meter is the best data because that is recording every second of the work that you can do. And then, if that's not available, then get the next best thing. Certainly a good heart rate monitor is the next best thing. And if you can go with something that helps you learn recovery, then the Whoop really makes a difference as well.
Awesome. And I don't want to belabor this, but would you ever, if someone just had like periodically they had like one power meter, like an indoor one, I guess would be an obvious one, but say they don't use it, they use it only 2 or 3 days during the winter and then they don't have it for 8 months of the year. Would you, in that case, be better to only use heart rate TSS and just ignore the power data for the sake of that TSS pool? Would that make sense and be a possible workaround?
Well, I tell you, I'd still use the power meter data, but then I would become highly calibrated to looking at what those numbers are, right? Because that's what I teach my athletes. I want them to know, okay, that was a 120 TSS ride. Okay, that was a 250 TSS ride. Oh, that was a 200 TSS ride. Mm-hmm. I want them to come back on their rides, and this is one of the first things that I do with my athletes is that I make sure that I say, okay, well, you're going to go out and you're going to do these workouts, and before you look at your Garmin and it says TSS for that ride, I want you to guess. Well, what did you get? 100 points is an hour at FTP, as hard as you can go. All right, so everything bases around that. What was that like? And so then really quickly within 2 or 3 weeks of playing the Guess My TSS game, they really start to get calibrated on, well, gosh, that was a solid 120 points, or, that was 85 points or whatever. And then they're also looking and looking at their heart rate averages, they're looking at their power averages, looking at their intervals they're doing. And so then when they go outside and they don't have a power meter outside, they're going to be fairly calibrated. They're going to be able to come back and say, okay, well, I uploaded my data to Training Peaks and it gave me 120 HRTSS, but that's really low. That was a much harder workout than that. That was 190, or 200. And then they can override that value in Training Peaks and just say, that's a 200-point ride. Right. So as long as you're honest with yourself, I think that's a great way to go.
Okay. Awesome. Hunter, thank you so much for your time. I'm wondering if you can just leave folks with sort of how they can follow you online, your preferred social medias, or any sort of things, courses or whatever you're sort of offering, or where they can find more about you and Peaks Coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can certainly go to our website, peakscoachinggroup.com. That's a great place. And I still have a few copies autographed by all three authors if you haven't gotten a copy of our third edition. So we got a good amount of those signed by all three. So I've still got a few left. So if you go on there, you can get a copy autographed by all three of us. And then we've got a tremendous social media presence as well, where we have a workout of the day on Peaks Coaching Group on Facebook, and put tips and fun things on there as well. You can follow me on Instagram. I'm Hunter Peaks on Instagram, and also Twitter, Hunter Peaks. So check those out. And yeah, absolutely. We'd love to have you come to a camp or coaching or buy a training plan or just buy a copy of the book.
Awesome. Well, I've been very appreciative, learned a bunch, took a ton of notes here, and I hope listeners will also enjoy the podcast, and then also reach out and use one of your services, or also get the book, because it is a great handbook to have. So thank you again, Hunter.
Awesome. Hey, thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Consummate Athlete podcast. You can check out my stuff over at theoutdooredit.com, or by following me on Instagram and Twitter at Molly J. Herford. And you can check out Peter's coaching, training plans, blogs, all that fun stuff over at smartathlete.ca, or by following him on Twitter and Instagram at Peter Glassford. And if you want to support this show and other awesome podcasts, please check out wideanglepodium.com for show info, other podcasts, bonus content, and to become a donating member so you can get all of that rad behind the scenes content and help keep shows like this on the air. And lastly, if you're enjoying this podcast and all the information that we're bringing to you every single week, do us a solid and pop into iTunes to leave us a rating and review. It takes you about 2 seconds. You can do it on your computer, you can do it on your phone, and it really helps us out. Thanks so much, and we will see you next week.